All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our very last session of the virtual Siouxland Garden Show for 2021. We are so excited to have everyone join us today, and we've loved having everyone join us for the past couple weeks for the shows. So we're excited to get started. My name is Kathleen Cue. I'm with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and I have Carol Larvik with Nebraska Extension with me today as well. So we're going to get started with our little welcome PowerPoint for everyone. So just a quick reminder to go ahead and join us in the comments section. So if you're joining us on Facebook Live, make sure to find the comments spot. If you're watching on our website, feel free to open the video into a browser, another tab. It's on a YouTube link, so you can use the YouTube comments area to ask any questions. If you don't have a YouTube account but would like to ask a question, you can jump over to the Facebook tab as well. That's from the website. We'd love to know where you're joining us from and if you're a master gardener. So make sure to find the comment spot, pop those answers to those two questions in there. And then also if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put them into the comments section. And then Kathleen will be able to answer them at the end. And just a reminder, we've had a great lineup of topics this year. So feel free to visit our Siouxland Garden Show website page. You can actually find the archives of all the sessions except for the Preserve the Taste of Summer, but we do have some other sessions coming up in the county for those. So if you're interested in the Preserve the Taste of Summer program, feel free to drop something in the comments or also check with the Woodbury County Extension Office and we can tell you when those programs are coming up. But all the other sessions are archived, so you can go back and watch the videos if you missed any of those sessions, or if this is the first one you've joined in and you'd like to jump on to any of those other topics. And of course, I got to say a big thank you to the Siouxland Garden Show Committee for putting together the awesome 2021 virtual show. Back in September, we made the tough decision to stay virtual after moving virtual in 2020. But it gave us a lot more time to prep and plan and make this a little bit sharper and cleaner for everyone to join us. In 2020, we had to make that call and just had a couple weeks to switch virtual. So it was nice to do a little bit more planning. This is a collaborative effort with Iowa State University Extension Outreach in Woodbury County, as well as Nebraska Extension in Dakota County. So we have Carrie King, Carol Larvik, Molly Hewitt, myself, Caitlin Brinkerhoff, Kevin Potabom, Emily Yockey, and the bottom three are master gardeners that help us on the committee as well. We have Rex Towns, Randy Burnite, and Diana Kincaid. So again, a big thank you to all the committee members for making this possible. And of course, we've been working hard on already planning our 2022 show. So make sure to save the date. It's going to be Friday, April 2nd and Saturday, April 3rd. We're going to be at the Marriott Hotel Center in South Sioux City, Nebraska. So if you attended our 2019 show, we'll be back in that same location. So this will be a great time for you guys to come out and still get these great educational sessions, but then you can also learn and buy from local garden vendors. We'll have a children's play area. Master gardeners will be kind of roaming the floor to help answer questions and lots of other fun stuff. It's $5 per day to join. So if you haven't come out to a garden show before in person, we'd love to have you out in 2022. And of course, a big thank you to all of our volunteers and vendors. We have over 70 Master Gardener volunteers that help us put on this in-person show. They help us with prepping, designing, answering questions, all kinds of stuff at our in-person show. So we were excited that we were still able to provide some continuing education for you folks during this crazy time, virtual time. And we're looking forward to being back in person in 2022. And a big thank you to our over 40 vendors that provide great education to the community, as well as great lawn and garden products as well. And another thank you to all of our awesome sponsors. We have them all listed here. You can always check the top left corner of the video to see the sponsor of today's video. If you'd like to learn more about any of our sponsors, feel free to visit the Siouxland Garden Show website page, and you can actually hover over their logos and it will take you to their website so that you can learn some more about them. All right, and we're going to be getting on with our very last presentation. So we're going to go ahead and pop Kathleen up onto the screen here. I'm going to take that down. And Kathleen, your PowerPoint should be up on the screen here. So Carol and I are going to go ahead and jump off, and the stage is yours.
All right, thanks to both of you. So So I'm going to be talking, hopefully you're seeing my screen right now, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, good. Thanks, Caitlin. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is utilizing annuals and perennials. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about these, we think automatically flowers. And from there, we think of, gardens and that sort of thing. But they play a very specific role in organizing outdoor spaces. And so I'll talk to you a lot today about how annuals and perennials add to that. But first, just a little levity. I know a lot of us are gardeners out there, and so it doesn't hurt to chuckle a little bit about some of these things. I, for one, know that I myself don't know where I'm going to put some of the plants I get sometimes. So hopefully you enjoyed this as much as I did. So moving on, I want to first talk about the 5 elements of design. And it may seem, among mass, form, line, texture, color, that really when we're talking annuals and perennials, we're really only talking about color. And that couldn't be further from the truth. All of these lend either quite a bit or very little to the 5 elements, but they all are part of what annuals and perennials do in a landscape. And so let's talk first about mass. Okay, so when we think about how Mother Nature landscapes, and a lot of the ideas that we take for how to organize outdoor spaces comes from what we see Mother Nature doing when it comes to organizing outdoor spaces. And so the unique communities that occur from where a forested area meets a meadow area, that's where we take a lot of our ideas for massing. And so massing really then becomes the overstory trees, so the medium and large trees that are in the landscape, then the understory trees, and these are the things that are like small or medium and large size shrubs and small trees. And then we get down to the ground plane on the forest floor, and that's where the small plants are made up on that forest floor. And that's where we think of the annuals and perennials coming into play as far as massing. And then from there, you come out into the ground plane area, which is the meadow or the prairie area or something like that. So the elements that fit for annuals and perennials really comes from that area at the forest floor. That's how we think of them fitting into Mother Nature and how things are designed. So when we look at this particular landscape, we can see that there's really not a good job of developing that ground plane area where you have lower perennials and annuals at the lowest level. And really what that does is it's a scale thing. It's what brings things down to our scale, and it helps us see those landscapes as something that we fit into. And when you have something like a large magnolia that really obscures things, then it really shows how intimidating that type of landscape can be, because it just doesn't look like something you'd want to venture into. And that little bit of ground cover that you see right in there really isn't enough to make that a good massing. And here we have a better example of that where, again, we've got the overstory, a good development of understory, and then the lower plants that make up that lower understory underneath of trees. And that's really what brings things down to scale. That's what makes us feel good in those types of landscapes. So massing, important function. Then we move on to form. And form is something that you've done tons of times if you've ever put a container together. And a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, I need a roundy moundy and a trailie. I've heard that very often. And those forms are really make an interest in our landscape, and it really doesn't have as much to do with flowering at that particular moment. It's what the foliage itself lends to that landscape. And so when I see spiky, I think of things like daylilies and irises and blackberry lilies. Some of the grasses fit into that category nicely. Rounded is something a little different in that primarily, if you look at the trees in tree lines and creek areas along fence lines, those are all mostly rounded. And so most of our trees fit that category of rounded as form. Mounded is as we get lower to the ground. You know, you still have kind of that rounded form, but it's located closer to the ground rather than higher up. And so in this particular landscape, you can see that we have a lot of mounded flowering plants that are fitting that category of that form. And then trailing plants, and that's where we see our ground covers. So creeping thyme, some of our sedums, they fit nicely into that trailing type of form. And then lastly is fastigiate, and that I always, that's my particular coined name for it, pencils in the landscape. So if you think of like Taylor juniper and skyrocket juniper and Techne arborvitae, some of those very upright plants, those are mostly evergreens, although there's a couple of things that we can get that are deciduous, but really not anything that you're going to find that annuals and perennials contribute to. So next we have line. And when we think of lines in the landscape, we think of those architectural lines that make up our homes, our businesses, all of those things that could use a little bit of softening. And annuals and perennials really fit into that category as like foundation plantings, near sidewalks, anything that, again, brings that detail down to the ground plane that makes it seem friendlier. And then there's one of very powerful design tool are the bed lines. So where the grassed area, which in this case can be prairie spaces, meets the forest, you've got that area edging in between. Those are the bed lines that I'm talking about here. And when we utilize annuals and perennials in those curved spaces, we really emphasize those curves and we really make them more beautiful. But you can certainly use straight lines when you're looking at bed lines. And a lot of times people think that they can't use straight lines because they're not as friendly. And that's not necessarily true. Plants do a wonderful job of even softening some of the straight lines in landscapes. Next is the idea of texture. And in this particular example, we have some bacopa that's represents some of the finer texture in this particular container. So you have small leaves or small flowers. Those lend texture in a landscape, but what they do is they tend to recede. They seem further away to us. Whereas when we see something that's coarse textured, like the senecio here, you've got the large leaves, or if you have something that's large flowered, or if it's hairy or fuzzy or anything like that, those tend to come forward to us. So when we're using annual and perennials that have large leaves and we're putting them at the end of a, say like a long straight area, it will help make that area seem shorter if you put something very coarse textured at the end of it, because it will advance. And then the reverse is true. If you have a very short area that you want to seem a little bit larger, then you can use more small plants in that fine textured things. Next, we move on to color. And this is something that I think a lot of our minds readily go to when we're thinking about annuals and perennials. But don't forget that a lot of annuals and perennials also will lend the foliage color changes as the season progresses too. So keep that in mind. And I've got the color wheel here just for you to see what that particular thing looks like, because it really helps us to think about how we're going to incorporate color into a landscape. And when we think of like the hot colors, we're talking red through yellow, that portion of the spectrum. Whereas the cool colors, we're thinking of blues through the greens, so the violets, blues, and greens. And then there's things like monochromatic. That's where you take a color, say like blue, add a little white to it to make it light blue, or add a little black to it to make it a darker blue. That's a monochromatic color scheme. Complementary colors are those that are opposite each other on the color wheel. They're natural companions because they complement one another. And then there's analogous color schemes. And that's when we choose like 3 or sometimes 5 colors on all one, they're all touching each other on the color wheel. So if we went with a violet, and blue, that would be an analogous color scheme in the landscape. Square is just like it sounds if they're equal distance apart from each other on the color wheel. So if we went violet, red, orange, yellow, and blue, green, that would be a square color scheme. And then there's what I like to call the anything goes. You know, there's ones where, you know, whatever somebody wants to put in, they put in, and that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with that. So here's an example for you on the left of a complementary color scheme. So purples and yellows are across from each other. And then the image on the right is kind of an anything goes. You know, we got a little bit of red, a little bit of pink, a little bit of white, yellow, a little bit of rusty red, a little bit of everything here. And so that would be an example of anything goes. So getting beyond the 5 elements to the design, you know, we can ask ourselves, what do annuals and perennials bring to a landscape? And I think all of these things, number one we think of is beautification. We think of beautification of that landscape as being the number one contribution that annuals and perennials make. But they do so much more than that. Most of the things that they do from our viewpoint are in these top 4 items here, whereas the other 2 are looking at things outside of ourselves, the bigger picture. Okay. So when we think of beauty, you know, we don't have to create gardens. So this is a garden space as opposed to simply a landscape space. And what we're really looking at here is just that striking color that you see in a landscape that really adds beauty and wonder to the site. But the other thing that they do is they really provide that interaction that's really nice to have. So for instance, in this, it's a rather simple composition because it's made up mostly of marigolds, but imagine the same space with the marigolds planted instead behind this line of shrubs. Has a very different feel then. So what really we want when we're using flowers, the annuals and perennials, is we're inviting that interaction, whether it's, you know, sticking your nose in a flower or observing the pollinator that comes to visit the flower. What we really want people to do is interact with those plants. And in those cases, we want to put them at crucial sites where we can definitely enjoy them. And so we don't hide those things away behind other things, even though the pollinators would kind of find them and still make use of them. We really want to put those plants where they're going to make the most sense to us. And if you visited with me a few weeks ago when I talked about using annuals and perennials for curb appeal, I talked a lot about how really the flowers should be close to the focal point, and the focal point from the curb is always the front door. But in the outdoor spaces, there's other focal points as well, and utilizing it where we're going to be sitting so we can enjoy them makes a lot of sense. And so here we have a park bench, and so not only does the bench say sit a spell, but the flowers that are placed there invite us to then enjoy what we're doing while we're sitting there. So having opportunities to work with those plants, to interact with them, is a key component. We don't think of plants as being guides necessarily or something that herds people along, but they are an excellent draw. They can draw people through a landscape. So imagine this, you know, town sidewalk area where there were no plants along the way. If it was just all concrete, it would be a much more barren space that isn't as fun and definitely not as softened. So we have a lot of architectural lines in this particular image that are softened by all the plants that are made up. And, you know, it's kind of those serendipitous things that come up in the cracks, but also some intentional things with the planters at the windows. So plants pull us through a landscape. They can literally pull us through. And it doesn't have to be a ton of them. something as simple as this Ligularia at the crossroads of where the bridge is can really help to make people pause in a space. So if you really want somebody to just simply enjoy a space, having a spot to pause, and that's what the color does there, is really something that's going to benefit when you're trying to guide people through a landscape. And remember what I said about them being a draw. Plants, you know, the color they provide are a huge draw to get us moving through a landscape. And so this really strong yellow of these lilies here is going to be something that pulls you across this yard to take a look at those flowers. And so it can be a destination as well as a place to sit a spell or just simply enjoy. And I think sometimes we don't recognize how plants and flowers can influence mood, but they definitely can. So just the kind of quiet flowers of the white of these hostas really are almost a solace, something that's soothing and can really influence that mood. Whereas you can also inflict some whimsy onto the viewer just by looking at something that's really fun. So flowers and the colors they provide do some really wonderful things as far as influencing mood. And then let's not forget that we're not alone, right? On this planet, there are other things that benefit. And one of the trends that we're seeing a lot in horticulture is that we don't want plants to do just one thing in the landscape. So we don't want necessarily them to just look pretty. We want them to do something else besides. And if it's something like benefiting pollinators, so much the better. So here on the left, we have the agastache, the licorice mint that you know, you don't really necessarily need. The butterfly sculpture here to indicate that this is really a butterfly garden space, because these flowers are going to be visited a lot by pollinators, and not just butterflies for that matter. It could be beetles and bees and all kinds of good things. So bearing in mind that, you know, when you plant annuals and perennials into a landscape, you have the possibility there of benefiting other things as well, like you know, if you're doing a lot of red flowers, you could benefit having hummingbirds in the landscape. And then on the right image here, we have lots of soldier beetles on top of the eupatorium. It's been renamed in the new genus of Tavara. And this plant is a relative of the Joe Pye weed. And then just thinking of plants, in particular annuals and perennials, that can really contribute to environmental stewardship. So the benefit of using native plants is they're used to periods of wet and periods of dry. And guess what? Here in the Midwest, we have lots of those kinds of seasons where we have a little bit of everything. And so having plants that are well adapted to that, like our natives are, is a real boon to landscapes. And in this particular composition, what I really like about this is this ground cover right here is buffalo grass. And so they've actually used it instead of as a turf plant, they've used it as a ground cover to be masked with the plantings here and provide that lower level of detail that then comes out to the regular turf grass. And so when we're doing things like that, there aren't inputs that we're putting in, like, you know, excess fertilizer, or, you know, more insecticides or things like that, because a lot of times I work with clients who think that if the label calls for something, they'll double it just because they think it will work better. And so if we don't even have to put those pesticides in people's hands because they don't need it, then so much the better. And that's being good environmental stewards. And so follow my thoughts on this, because it's not often that we think of environmental stewardship when we're planting things on a hillside area. But if you think about mowers as being one of the most polluting things in our landscapes, they're one of the most polluting tools that we use in our landscape, then areas where we don't need to put turf, then let's not do that. And so in this particular landscape, we have no turf planted in the area between the sidewalk and the street. Some people call those inferno strips. And then on the bank itself, so not only do we get to look at something really beautiful in this landscape, but then also you're not having to put a mower down this particular landscape. It'll certainly be a safety issue that you don't have to worry about. And so just utilizing, rethinking where we're using turf grass rather than in all the leftover spaces out there, instead being intentional with where the turf grass goes, and instead doing some of these really creative things with outdoor spaces that actually end up making us good environmental stewards. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about rain gardens. Rain gardens are not water features. They are intentional depressions made in the soil to allow water percolation through the soil. When we talk about water percolation through the soil, we think first about the water table, where that water tends to collect. But then we think of water that goes beyond the water table and further goes pulled down by gravity into aquifers. And it takes a tremendous number of years for aquifers to be recharged. And so when we have chances to allow water to percolate into the ground rather than going towards runoff, we're becoming better stewards of our spaces. Aquifers, a lot of us know that they're drying out. They're losing water faster than they're recharging. Also, we know that a lot of times when we're putting in plants into these water rain garden spaces, what happens then is the incredibly deep, let me put this up here real quick because this shows you, the incredibly deep root system that a lot of our native plants have help to draw that water downward. And so I know this is really hard to see, but this scale is 15 feet. So some of our native plants have root systems that occupy spaces deeper than some of our trees do. And just so you know, this little plant clear on the left here is Kentucky bluegrass. So that gives you an idea of just how incredibly deep these root systems are. There was a rain garden that was put in the Carter Lake, Iowa area. And the soils that they were working with to put in these depressed areas, to put in the native plants, were taking 48 hours to drain. Now that's a little worrisome because we know that a lot of times it takes about 48 hours for mosquito larvae to hatch. So anything longer than that, and then we're actually creating mosquito problems. So it was good at least that it was draining in 48 hours. But that was that first year of the garden. And by the time they moved to the second year with more development of some of these deeper roots, they had shortened that time span to 24 hours. And so don't discount how deep these roots go can really benefit rain gardens. And we have some absolutely beautiful native perennial plants that would fit the bill nicely for rain gardens. I know a lot of you may not have spots for green roofs, but it's something that bears thought here, because what we're seeing is a lot of sedum and other low-growing type plants put on roof spaces. And there are multiple benefits of having green roofs. Not only does it mitigate the amount of stormwater that's going into our storm drains, it's actually being held in the soilless mediums that these plants are planted in, but it makes the roof overall cooler than if it was just a solid asphalt surface. And so, where do a lot of flat roofs put their air conditioner units? They put them on the tops of buildings. And so they're having to work doubly hard on regular roofs to keep those things cool in order for them to work efficiently. And so when we're putting plants in those spots, we can actually make it a better environment, and those units actually last longer. And then lastly, a lot of these asphalt roofs will have a rubber liner beneath them. It will make the rubber liners last longer just by having a green roof. So having all of these things in place really contributes to having a healthier environment. All right then, so we have some time for questions, if there's any questions.
All right, we'll go ahead and give some time for folks to put in any questions that they might have. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and quick toss the link to today's evaluation into the comments. And then I will show you where you can find that on our website as well. So if you look in the comments, I have the link directly to the evaluation. If you're watching on the website, feel free to jump over to the speakers tab. And if you go down to Kathleen's second session, so you'll want to make sure that you find her second one, and you click on that, you will be able to find the evaluation link there. So it looks like we might not have any questions yet. We'll wait here for just another minute. Carol, would you like to jump on at all?
I will jump on because I do have a question. So, Kathleen, if you would talk just a little bit more about proportion of like the low plants to the larger plants. Let's say you have a flower bed and behind it is trees or something taller. And you talked about the bed lines. And that's something that I think I need to look more about. Can you talk a little bit about proportion of maybe those bed lines to everything else?
Yeah, so a lot of times when we're using, so say for instance, you have some really large trees and they're not even your trees, they're neighbors' trees. And you want to bring that really tall height down to scale. Then it's a matter of putting in different plants that gradually bring that down. So you wouldn't want to necessarily just put perennials next to the really tall, say, evergreen trees, because it doesn't really bring the eye down enough. When it's deciduous trees that are nearby, yes, you can get by with that. But when it's really just that straight wall of trees, then it's nice to have maybe something like a smaller tree or a medium-sized shrub to bring the eye down. And so in some of those spaces, and I've actually heard this formula before, that whatever the height of that border is, you want the same length in that border. So say you have trees that are 20 feet tall, to really bring it down, you need to have it out about 20 feet as well, which seems like a lot of space. I mean, for some of us, that's a lot of our yard. But anything that you can do to bring it down as gradually as you can is going to be the way to do it. If you do it too abruptly, you'll know it because it will just not look right to you. And so that's it. There's no one rule of thumb that's going to work for you there. You really just have to let your eyes decide if that works or not.
So can you talk a little bit about how to help make the division between the grass and those beds a little bit easier to manage?
There are tons of things on the market that you can use to separate the bed line from the turf grass area. There's all the way from the edging to the bricks to any kind of thing. I personally use what I call the natural edge, where I use my spade to cut down about 4 inches just to make that bed line natural looking. The downside to it is that, you have to recut it every so often because it will fill in with mulch over time. But the plus side to it is if you're like me and you're always moving stuff around, it's really handy to not have to worry about having something put in stone like when you use brick or something like that. So anything that you can use like that is going to be helpful just to separate those areas. And I absolutely would recommend that you separate out those areas. And if you can have it so just a little bit of mulch shows before you hit the turf grass area, that's going to be easier to manage because you can just then put your mower right on the mulch area and mow down through that line without having to do that second step of a weed eater.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions that are coming in. Carol, did you have any more in mind?
Well, I do know how to contact Kathleen, so I can grab her later if I do. But those are a couple of them that, as she was talking, I thought our viewers might be interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if anybody is watching this later on, Kathleen did pop up her contact information earlier, but you can also fill out the evaluation and we can get you in contact with Kathleen that way as well. So Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us again. And a big thank you to everyone that's been joining in throughout all of our sessions. We've been seeing a lot of familiar names in the comments, and it's been kind of exciting to see that we're pulling in folks from all over South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa, as well as we've had people from Minnesota, Pennsylvania, all over. So it's been kind of exciting to see. So thank you to everyone for joining us throughout our 2021 Virtual Siouxland Garden Show. And again, thank you, Kathleen, and we'll see everyone on the next one.